Welcome, nighttime traveler, to Sleepy Bedtime Stories, your haven of stories and tales to help you sleep. This is the place where traditional tales come to life and accompany you on your journey to rest. But first, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know if you're joining me from your bed, from a cozy sofa, or perhaps from some corner of the world where you can still feel the spirit of ancient tales. Please leave me a comment. Every message from you is like a fragment of a precious amphora. If you'd like to support this space of peace and relaxation, subscribe and share the channel so that more people can find their refuge here. And now, take a slow, deep breath, because tonight we're going to dive into another thrilling story.
The Clock That Told the Time to Rest. Chapter 1. The First Tick That Invited You to Stop. Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of the day dissolve, little by little, like mist over a river at dawn. This story is in no hurry. This story exists for you, for this moment when the world stands still and silence begins to take on a form of its own. There is a sound that human beings have sought for thousands of years. It is not the sound of the wind through the trees, though that too has its magic. It is not the murmur of water over stones, though that too is soothing. It is something simpler, older. It is the sound of something that marks the passing of time calmly, with patience, with the quiet certainty that every moment has its place. A sound that says, without words, that you can stop now, that it is enough. That rest is not a reward to be earned, but a natural part of all that exists. That sound is the ticking of a clock, and this is its story. Imagine for a moment that you find yourself on a night many centuries ago. We are somewhere in the Mediterranean, perhaps on the shores of what we now call Greece, perhaps on the shores of ancient Egypt. The sky is completely clear, and the stars are not competing with any artificial light, because that sort of light does not yet exist. There are thousands and thousands of shining points against a dark velvet backdrop, and each one of them is a compass, a calendar, a clock. A human being is lying on the ground, looking up. They are not asleep yet, but are in that sweet state that precedes sleep, that state where thoughts slow down and worries lose their sharp edges. They are watching the very slow movement of the stars. They are listening to the silence of the night. And in that silence, something inside them tells them it is time, that the body is calling for it. that the darkness exists for a reason, that human being has no name in our story. It could be anyone. It could be you. If we strip away the centuries and leave only the essentials, a weary body, a mind seeking rest, and the night waiting with infinite patience. Since the dawn of human history, time has been a conversation between light and darkness. Not a struggle, but a conversation. The sun rose and life awoke. The sun would set and life would withdraw into itself, like a flower closing its petals as evening falls. It was that simple. It was that wise. Early humans did not need clocks because the sky was the only clock that mattered. And that clock had a quality that later inventions took a long time to recapture. It told the truth. When it grew dark, it was time to rest. No negotiation. No excuses. No more tasks to finish. There is something profoundly beautiful in imagining those earliest human communities, perhaps 30 or 40,000 years ago, organizing their lives around the natural rhythms of the planet. When archaeologists study the oldest settlements we know of, when they analyze the remains of fires and the bones of animals consumed on long winter nights, is greater than when they read in the ashes the story of how our ancestors lived. They discover something surprising. Those people slept far more than we do. And they slept differently. Not in a continuous block of 8 hours, but in conversation with the night. They fell asleep as darkness fell. They would wake up for a while in the middle of the night, perhaps to gaze at the fire or whisper to those nearby. And then they would go back to sleep until the light of dawn summoned them back to the world. That pattern, which for centuries modern medicine regarded as a problem or an anomaly, turns out to be, in fact, the natural pattern of human sleep. Researchers call it biphasic sleep. And when studying cultures that still live far from electricity and artificial schedules, that pattern continues to appear with the calm regularity of something that belongs to our deepest nature. The night has 2 parts, and between those 2 parts there is a space of conscious stillness that our ancestors did not consider a problem to be solved, but a gift bestowed upon them by the darkness. But let us return to the stars. For it was by gazing at the sky that human beings took their first steps towards measuring time. And it was that measurement, curiously enough, that ended up separating us from our natural rhythms. Not suddenly, not cruelly, but slowly, with the treacherous gentleness of a change that occurs so slowly it is barely noticeable. In the Nile Valley, approximately 5,000 years ago, there lived a civilization that had turned the observation of the sky into both a science and a religion. The ancient Egyptians gazed at the stars with an intensity that we today reserve for our screens. They knew the movements of the heavens with astonishing precision, and used that knowledge to organize their communal life: when to plant, when to harvest, when to await the flooding of the Nile, which each year deposited on its banks the fertile silt that made life possible in the midst of the desert. But they also used the sky for something more intimate, to tell the time at night. Egyptian priests developed what we now call star clocks. These were carefully drawn charts indicating which star or group of stars should be in which position in the sky at every hour of the night. A priest would sit in the darkness, facing another priest sitting perfectly still, and align his gaze with specific stars above the head, the shoulder, and the ear of his motionless companion. And thus he measured the passing of the hours in the darkness. It was an almost meditative act, almost sacred. The priest who measured the night was not seen as someone who stole hours from sleep, but as someone who guarded time, who looked after it, who ensured that the night had its order and structure. And here, in this seemingly minor detail, lies an idea that deserves our attention for a moment. The Egyptians did not measure the night to conquer it or to fill it with activity. They measured it to honor it, to know when each sacred vigil ended and when rest should begin. The oldest clock in history was not a call to do more things, but an invitation to know when to stop. Think about that as you feel the weight of your body on the bed, as you notice how every part of you is surrendering to gravity, as if the earth itself were gently cooling you down towards the rest you deserve. 1,600 years before our era, in the Egypt of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, one of the most elegant inventions humanity has ever produced appeared: the water clock, or clepsydra. It was a stone or clay vessel with a small hole in its base. It was filled with water, and the water dripped slowly, with a patience that cannot be feigned, marking the passage of time by the lowering of its level. Someone had carved marks inside the vessel to indicate the hours. And so, the amount of water remaining told the observer what time it was, or how much time had passed since the vigil began. There is something about the image of that first water clock that is deeply soothing when you really think about it. Water is in no hurry. Water cannot be hastened or slowed by human will. Water simply flows with a serene indifference of nature. And the time it marks is a gentle time, continuous, without the jolts of the mechanical ticking that would come many centuries later. It is a time that slips by, that merges with the night, that does not strike but caresses. Hourglasses were used in Egypt for centuries. Then they traveled to Greece, where philosophers used them to measure the time of their speeches in court, where a speaker had a set amount of water to defend his case and knew that when the last drop fell, he must fall silent. They also traveled to Rome, where they became luxury household items, decorated with figures of gods and planets, found in the homes of patricians and in the halls of senators. But in most homes of the ancient world, for thousands of years, the night was not measured by any instrument. It was felt. It was lived. It was heard in the song of the crickets that marked the summer, in the different silence of winter, in the distant bark of a dog, in the first crow of the cock announcing dawn. The human body was the most sophisticated clock available, and that clock never lied about what it needed. Let your body speak to you now. Listen to it. It says it is tired, and that tiredness is honest. It is real. It is the sum of everything you have given today. Do not ask it to wait any longer. It has waited long enough. Let's travel west now, crossing the Mediterranean in the dark, following the routes the Phoenicians knew by heart, until we reach the shores of what is now Spain or Portugal, or perhaps further north, towards the misty shores of what is now Great Britain. We are in an era that historians call the Bronze Age, approximately 2,000 years before our era. And in these lands of Northern Europe, where the difference between the long summer day and the endless winter night can be many hours, time was an existential concern of the first order. The people who lived in these lands built monuments to measure time. The best known are the great stone circles, such as the majestic Stonehenge in what is now the county of Wiltshire, in England. Those enormous stones, some of which were transported from mountains hundreds of kilometers away, are positioned with an astronomical precision that continues to amaze modern scientists. At the summer solstice, the sun rises exactly at the point indicated by the stones. At the winter solstice, the same thing happens, but in the opposite direction. No one knows with absolute certainty what rituals were performed at these sites, but researchers are reasonably certain that Stonehenge and similar monuments dotting the European landscape were, among other things, calendars, instruments for measuring not only the hours of the day, but the cycles of the year. To know when the seasons began, when it was time to sow, when it was time to light the great solstice bonfires that dispelled the fears of the deepest winter, and when it was time to rest, because rest too had its season. Winter, with its very long nights and its short grey days, was, in many ancient cultures, a season of retreat. Animals hibernate, plants store their energy underground, and human beings, in those times without artificial light, naturally slept more, moved less, gathered round the fire and told stories. The time of rest was not a time of failure or unproductivity. It was the time when life prepared to blossom anew. There is a word in the Scandinavian languages that has no exact translation into English, hygge. Although it is Danish, it captures something that must have been universal during the long nights of the North, that feeling of inner warmth, of shelter, of being safe from the cold with loved ones and a soft light, without needing to do anything in particular. Just being, just resting, just existing in the comfort of the present moment. Our ancestors did not need to be taught how to rest. They knew it instinctively. The body knew it. The sky told them so. The seasons marked it. Rest was part of the contract with life, as natural as breathing, as necessary as eating. But something began to change. Very slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. Something began to change with the advent of cities. In Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago, in the cities of Ur, Babylon, and Nineveh, something began that we recognize perfectly today. Time began to be valuable. Not in the sense of being precious and mysterious, as it was for the Egyptian priest who aligned the stars in the darkness, but in the economic sense, time began to be something that could be gained or lost, something for which one had to account. The Babylonian temples kept detailed records. Merchants arriving with their caravans laden with spices. Metals and textiles depended on punctuality to close their deals. The astronomers of Babylon, who developed a sexagesimal system that we still use today when we divide the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds, gazed at the sky with one eye on the cosmos and the other on business. But even in the busiest cities of antiquity, night remained night. Darkness was a boundary that very few could or would cross. Torches and oil lamps were expensive, and their flames were a nuisance. Is greater than. Artificially lighting the darkness was a luxury, not the norm. And that meant that the vast majority of human beings, from the most powerful king to the humblest slave, retired when the sun went down and did not resume their activities until the sun returned. Sleep was democratic in ancient times. It placed kings and beggars on an equal footing beneath the same necessary darkness. And in that sleep, in that shared darkness, something happened that the ancients understood better than we perhaps do. Dreams were messages. Dreams were visions. Dreams were the space where the divine and the human met without the barriers that wakefulness erected. The Egyptians had temples dedicated specifically to the incubation of dreams, where the sick and those seeking answers would lie down in sacred chambers in the hope that the god sleeping with them would show them the way. The Greeks had the same ritual in the temples of Asclepius, the god of medicine. To sleep was to heal. To sleep was to know. To sleep was, in the most literal sense of the word, sacred. Feel that sacredness now. Feel that this moment, this surrender to the approaching sleep, is yours too. That there is nothing more important to do right now. That the rest you seek is as ancient and as legitimate as any other human need you can imagine. The history of clocks is, in a way, the history of the relationship between human beings and time, and more specifically, it is the story of how we went from being creatures living within time to creatures attempting to control time. That change did not happen overnight. It was a transformation that spanned millennia, with advances and setbacks, with moments of clarity and moments of confusion. One of the most beautiful chapters in that story took place in ancient Greece, around the 5th century BC. In that extraordinary period of human history, when Athens was the center of an unprecedented philosophical and political experiment, a man named Ctesibius developed a water clock so sophisticated that it can be considered the first clock mechanism proper. It not only measured time, but also indicated it, a figure that rose slowly as the water filled the vessel pointed towards the hour marks carved into a column. It was a mechanical object, automatic, that operated on its own. It was, in miniature, the promise of what was to come centuries later. But Ctesibius did not invent his clock to enslave anyone. He invented it for the same reason that the Greek philosophers did everything they did, out of curiosity, for the pleasure of understanding, out of wonder at the possibility that human intelligence could capture the mysteriously fluid nature of time in a mechanism. Aristotle, the great systematizer of Greek philosophy, wrote about time with a depth that still gives us pause for thought. For Aristotle, time was not something that existed independently of movement and perception. Time was the number of motion, the measure of that which changes. And if there were no one to perceive that change, to count it, to name it, would time exist? It was a question that fascinated him, and one that still has no simple answer, even 2,400 years later. But what Aristotle did know, what all the Greeks knew in a practical sense, and not just philosophically, is that the body needed rest. Aristotle himself wrote of sleep as a natural process of cooling the body, as the necessary withdrawal of the senses after the exertion of wakefulness. He was mistaken in the details, as is natural for someone who lived 2,400 years before modern neuroscience. But he was right on the fundamental point. Sleep is not a pause in life. Sleep is part of life. Sleep is where life repairs and prepares itself. Let yourself be restored. Let yourself be prepared. There is nothing you need to do right now except surrender to this gentle and necessary moment. When the Roman Empire was at its height, between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE, the city of Rome had become the largest urban center the Western world had ever seen. With over 1 million inhabitants at its peak, the city pulsed with an energy that never quite stopped, not even at night. Merchants unloaded their goods at night so as not to clog the streets during the day. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn. Night watchmen patrolled the narrow streets whilst most of the city slept. The Romans divided the night into 4 watches of equal length, each marked by the changing of the guard at the barracks and along the city walls. The first watch began at sunset and lasted until around midnight. The second watch passed in the deepest silence. The third watch was that mysterious part of the night when dreams are most vivid. And the fourth watch ended with the first crow of the cock and the gradual return of light. That system was no different, in essence, from the one the Egyptians had used for thousands of years. It was a way of structuring the darkness, of giving it a framework, of recognizing that the night had its own divisions and its own logic. And the logic of the Roman night, like that of the Egyptian night, was one of rest interrupted only by the necessities of collective care. In the homes of the wealthier Roman citizens, the night began after supper, which was the main meal and could stretch on for hours if there were guests and wine and conversation. But even at those long, festive suppers, there always came a moment when the light from the lamps seemed to grow dimmer, when voices dropped in tone, when eyelids began to droop. The Roman body, like the Greek body, like the Egyptian body, like the human body of any era, knew how to recognize the moment when the day had ended. And the clocks that existed in Rome, the ornate water clocks and the sundials in the public forums, were not designed to tell people to carry on. They were designed so that people would know where they stood in the flow of time, so that the slave carrying an urgent letter would know if he would arrive on time, so that the lawyer in court could calculate how much of his turn remained, so that the senator would know when the session began. The clock was a tool at the service of life, not a tyrant that ruled it. That distinction is important. And in the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire, in the Middle Ages, which textbooks sometimes describe as a period of regression, but which was in fact a time of profound and silent transformation, that distinction began to change. It began to change with the sound of bells. The bells of medieval monasteries mark one of the most significant moments in the history of time. In the 6th century AD, a Roman monk named Benedict of Nursia wrote a rule for life in the monastic community that would become one of the most influential documents in the entire history of the West. The rule of Saint Benedict laid down with pinpoint precision the rhythms of a monk's life: when to pray, when to work, when to eat, when to sleep, and when to wake in the middle of the night for matins. That prayer recited in the deepest hours of darkness. For Benedict, regularity was not a form of control, but a form of freedom. If the monk knew exactly what he had to do at every moment of the day and night, he was freed from the anxiety of choice. The monastic schedule was, in that sense, a gift, the structure that allowed the mind to quieten because it did not have to constantly decide what to do next. There is something about this concept that is surprisingly modern. Contemporary psychologists speak of decision fatigue, of the exhaustion caused by the constant need to choose. And they speak of how fixed routines, repeated rituals, habits that require no deliberation free up mental energy and reduce anxiety. Benedict knew this in the 6th century, with a profound insight into human nature that neuroscience would take 15 centuries to confirm. Benedictine monks would wake in the middle of the night to pray matins. Then they would go back to sleep. Then they would rise for Lauds, the dawn service. This biphasic sleep pattern, which, as we have seen, is the natural pattern for human beings, was integrated into monastic life, not as a rarity, but as a recognized norm. The night had a period of consecrated wakefulness, and that period, far from disrupting sleep, formed part of its deep rhythm. In the centuries that followed, monasteries became the most advanced centers of knowledge in the Western world. And one of the most practical forms of knowledge they cultivated was precisely the measurement of time. They needed to know when to pray, and to know when to pray at night. When the sun could not serve as their guide, they needed instruments. The water clocks that had survived from classical antiquity were adapted to the needs of the monastic timetable. New ways of measuring the hours of the night were developed, and at some point in the 13th or 14th century AD, in some monastery or in some workshop, in some European city, whose exact name we do not know for certain, someone invented something that would change the world in a way that no one could have foreseen. Someone invented the escapement mechanism. The escapement is the heart of all mechanical watches that existed from the 13th century well into the 20th century. It is a system of cogwheels and levers that alternately lock and unlock, controlling the release of energy stored in a weight or a spring. And as they lock and unlock, they produce a sound, a binary sound, regular, hypnotic, tick, tock, tick, tock. That sound, which we now associate with old wooden clocks that might be found in a grandfather's house or in a room in a historic house, was, in its day, the most modern and astonishing sound that the inhabitants of medieval cities had ever heard. It was the sound of time becoming mechanical, the sound of time captured, tamed, put at the service of human beings in a mechanism that did not depend on water, nor on the stars, nor on the intuition of the priest gazing at the sky. The first mechanical clocks were neither pocket watches nor wall clocks. They were enormous machines, towers of gears and counterweights installed in the towers of cathedrals and town halls in medieval European cities. The first mechanical clock for which we have reliable documentation was installed in Milan in 1335. Although it is almost certain that similar mechanisms existed in other cities before that date, and simply no documents have survived to clearly attest to this. Imagine that moment. A medieval town in northern Italy, with its narrow streets and stone houses clustered around the great cathedral. An autumn dawn, with the mist from the river Lombardy drifting low over the rooftops. And suddenly, from the tower overlooking the central square, a new sound, not the sound of the bells the citizens had always known, which called them to prayer or announced a fire or summoned the assembly, but a different sound, mechanical, regular, without the warm vibration of struck bronze, but with the cold precision of a mechanism that never sleeps and never tires. That first mechanical tick over the city was, in a way, the first tick that invited all the others to stop. Or more precisely, it was the first step in a long process in which mechanical time began to become intertwined with people's daily lives, for better or for worse. At first, The mechanical clocks on medieval towers had no minute hand. They only had an hour hand. The hour was sufficient. The minute was a level of precision that life at that time did not require. If the tower clock struck 6, everyone knew it was roughly early morning in winter, that it was time to open the shops or light the ovens. It didn't matter whether it was exactly 6 minutes past 6 or 8 minutes to 6. Time still had leeway. Time still breathed. There is something deeply reassuring about that idea. A time that breathes. A time that does not demand the precision of the second or the millisecond. A time that is guidance rather than tyranny. That says roughly, and that is enough. Historians who study daily life in medieval Europe describe a relationship with time that is almost impossible for us to imagine from our current perspective. The working day did not have a precisely fixed start and end time. The length of the working day varied according to the season. In summer, when there was daylight, people worked longer. In winter, when darkness fell early, people worked less. Employment contracts of the time, where they existed, referred to tasks completed rather than hours worked. The unit of measurement for work was not time, but the result. That too would change, but it would take time to change. And in the meantime, the tower clocks continued to mark the hours with their newborn ticking, and the bells continued to ring at dawn and at midday and at sunset, and the lives of most Europeans continued to flow with a relationship to time that still had much of the old rhythm. The natural rhythm, the rhythm that the body knows without anyone needing to teach it. Let your body remind you of that rhythm now. Let your breathing slow down a little. Let the space between each breath grow a little longer. Time, tonight, is yours. There is no clock you need to check. Is greater than there is no time you must keep to. There is only this gentle darkness and the soft sound of your own rest drawing near. The 13th, 14th and 15th centuries in Europe were a period of enormous and simultaneous transformations. The Black Death, which in the 14th century killed a third or more of the European population, radically altered the social and economic structure of the continent. The survivors of the catastrophe found a world in which labor was scarce and, therefore, more valuable. For the first time in centuries, workers could negotiate their terms with some power. And in that context, working time began to be a bargaining chip. And it was then that mechanical clocks began to take on a significance that went beyond religious devotion or scientific curiosity. If a worker's time was valuable, It was important to know exactly how long they worked, and to know that time had to be measured more precisely. The minute hand, which appeared on clocks towards the end of the 15th century, was not merely a technical advance. It was also a statement about the new importance of minutes in economic life. But before we delve into that story, before we enter the period when the clock would become truly tyrannical and rest would begin to be seen as a weakness to be overcome, I want to pause for a moment on something different, on an inventor and philosopher who lived at the heart of the Middle Ages and who thought about time with a depth that is still astonishing. His name was Roger Bacon. He was an English Franciscan friar who lived in the 13th century and who was ahead of his time, as is often the case with great minds. Suspected of magic and heresy for much of his life. Roger Bacon did not merely study time, he studied the perception of time. He observed something that anyone can verify with a little attention, that time does not always pass at the same subjective speed. That an hour of suffering can seem like a day. That a night of deep sleep can seem like an instant. That joy speeds up time and boredom slows it down. For Bacon, this variability was not a flaw in human perception, but a fundamental characteristic of the reality of time. Time measured by clocks was just one way of understanding time. There was another time, lived time, felt time, which obeyed completely different laws. And he was right. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Bacon intuited in the 13th century. The human brain does not register time uniformly. In states of high concentration, subjective time is compressed. In states of deep relaxation and sleep, subjective time expands or simply disappears. When we sleep, we do not experience the passing of the hours. We do not feel 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning. We are outside of time, in that clockless space that is deep sleep. And when we wake up, time has passed, but we have not endured it. That is exactly what awaits you now. A space without time. A pause in the flow of the hours where there will be nothing to mark and nothing to measure. Only the warm silence of sleep doing its invisible and necessary work. In medieval monasteries, whilst friars such as Roger Bacon pondered time and perception and the nature of things, mechanical clocks gradually improved. Each generation of craftsmen added refinements. The mechanisms became more precise, more durable, more elegant. And something that had initially been merely functional was also becoming beautiful. Astronomical clocks, which began to appear in the 14th century, were works of art as much as they were measuring instruments. They displayed not only the time, but also the phases of the moon, the movements of the known planets, and the signs of the zodiac. They were miniaturized representations of the cosmos, small mechanical universes that reproduced in bronze and steel the movements of the heavens that Egyptian priests had observed with the naked eye from their stone terraces. The Prague astronomical clock, built in 1410, is still in working order today and remains one of the city's most visited monuments. Every hour, its automaton figures parade in a small mechanical spectacle that modern tourists photograph with their smartphones. But when it was built, it was more than just a spectacle. It was a demonstration that human beings could capture the order of the universe in a mechanism made of metal and wheels. It was, in a way, an affirmation of trust in the cosmos. If the cosmos has an order and clocks can reproduce that order, then the universe is comprehensible, and comprehension brings peace of mind. That tranquility is perhaps the most honest legacy that the first clocks left us. Not the tyranny of the minute nor the pressure of the deadline, but the confidence that time has its own rhythm, that rhythm has its own order, and that within that order there is a place for rest as legitimate and as necessary as the place for work. The craftsmen who made those first mechanical watches were people who knew time intimately, not in the sense that they lived enslaved by it, but in the sense that they worked with it, that they understood it, who knew that a wheel turning too fast would wear out and fail, that a spring always under maximum tension would eventually snap, that the best mechanisms were those that struck a balance between tension and rest. The best mechanisms are those that strike a balance between tension and rest. That is not just watchmaking wisdom. It is human wisdom. And it is the wisdom that this story has sought to convey from the very beginning, that rest is not the absence of life, but part of it. That sleep is not an interruption of time, but one of its deepest manifestations. That darkness is not the enemy of light, but its necessary companion. The most ancient civilizations knew this. The Egyptian priests who measured the stars knew this. The Greek philosophers who wrote about sleep knew this. The Benedictine monks who structured their lives around the natural rhythm of wakefulness and rest knew this. The medieval craftsmen who made clocks with the patient patience of those who understand that good things cannot be rushed knew this. And you know it too. Your body knows it right now, at this very moment, with the weight of your eyelids and the gentleness of your breathing and the warmth enveloping every muscle as it gives way. Somewhere in northern Europe, in some medieval town whose cobbled streets are now walked by tourists, unaware that they tread upon the echoes of 1,000-year-old history. One night, a clockmaker finished assembling the first escapement mechanism that worked perfectly. He put the last wheel in place. He carefully wound the spring, and the mechanism began to move. Tick, tock, tick, tock. A small sound in a small room, but a sound that would carry time towards a future that no one could yet imagine. The clockmaker heard that first tick in the darkness, and what he felt, if we may speculate on it with the historical imagination afforded by the documents and contexts, was not a desire to conquer time or to fill it with tasks. What he felt, in all likelihood, was admiration. The quiet wonder of the craftsman who sees at work that into which he has poured all his knowledge and all his patience. The wonder of one who realizes he has created something that has its own rhythm, its own mechanical life, its own way of marking the moments. And then, without a doubt, he blew out the candle and went to sleep, because it was night, and that was what the night was for. The first tick that invited one to pause was also, paradoxically, the first in a long story in which clocks and sleep would engage in a complex conversation, at times harmonious and at times tense. That story will continue in the next chapter. When the Industrial Revolution arrives with its machines and its shifts and its new relationship with time, when the pocket watch changes the lives of millions of people, when the English scientist named Matthew Walker spends his nights measuring what happens in the brains of those who sleep and changes our understanding of sleep forever, when the fight for the 8-hour day becomes a trade union battle of global significance, when electricity brings light into the heart of the night and forever changes the relationship between humanity and darkness. But that story is for another time, for another night. Tonight, the only thing that matters is this: from the first humans who gazed at the stars whilst lying on the ground, to the Egyptian priest who aligned the constellations above his companion's motionless head, to the Benedictine monk who prayed matins in the darkness and then returned to his cell to sleep, to the medieval craftsman who blew out his candle with satisfaction after hearing the first perfect tick of his mechanism. All of them knew something that we too know, that the night exists for a reason, that the body needs to rest, that sleep is a form of ancient wisdom, and that now, at this very moment, in this darkness that surrounds you, in this silence that is growing deeper and warmer, is exactly the moment to surrender to that wisdom. The ticking of time continues somewhere, but tonight you don't have to count it. Tonight, the seconds and the minutes and the hours can go on their way without you. You stay here, in this space without clocks, in this place where time becomes as gentle as the water of an hourglass falling drop by drop into the darkness of an ancient temple. The stars remain in their place above you. They have been there for billions of years, watching human beings sleep. Tonight they are watching you too, with that serene indifference that is the closest thing to peace the universe can offer. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow down. Let your thoughts turn into images and the images into nothing, into that luminous nothingness that precedes sleep and which is, in its silent way, the most beautiful thing that exists. The first tick that invited you to stop still sounds softly in the distance, like a heart like yours that beats effortlessly, that has been beating all day without asking your permission, that is now also slowing down a little, that also knows it is time. Sleep. It is time. The clock that told the hour to rest. Chapter 2. The seconds that stopped ticking. The night has always been a threshold, a place that belongs neither wholly to the day nor to sleep, but to that soft, diffuse space that exists between the two. And on that threshold, for centuries, there was something that marked the passing of time with a particular cadence, is greater than with a rhythm that was neither urgent nor demanding, but simply present, like the heartbeat of something alive and calm, like the breathing of a house when all its inhabitants have finally found rest. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are in an old room. The walls bear the texture of time, that soft patina accumulated unhurriedly over the years. There is a window with half-closed shutters, and through the gap a strip of moonlight enters, tracing a pale line across the wooden floor. It smells of smouldering firewood, of wool, of something vaguely reminiscent of lavender. And in some corner of that room, on a ledge or hanging on the wall, there is a clock. You don't need to see it to know it's there. You can hear it. A soft tick, almost a whisper, that repeats with the same patience with which the water of a stream always finds its way between the stones. That sound is the protagonist of this story, not the clock itself, but the seconds that clock has measured over the centuries, the seconds that passed while someone, somewhere in the world, surrendered to sleep for the first time after a very long day. the seconds that accompanied the slow closing of eyelids, the seconds that stop ticking. For there is a beautiful paradox at the heart of this story. Time, that relentless builder of all that exists, that invisible weaver linking the past with the future, also possesses an art that is seldom acknowledged, the art of stopping, or more precisely, the art of making it seem as though it has stopped, of becoming so gentle, so imperceptible, so close to silence, that whoever hears it ends up believing that the world has paused its movement and that, for an infinite instant, all is well. Let us journey then. Let us journey through the centuries, following that invisible thread that connects all human beings who have ever listened to a clock whilst preparing for sleep. We shall not rush. There is no hurry in this story, because the story we are going to tell is precisely the story of those who learnt not to be in a hurry. We are in the heart of Europe, somewhere between what we now call France and what was then known as the Kingdom of the Franks. The exact year is difficult to pinpoint, but historians place this period around the 8th century AD. The world is dark at night, genuinely and unly dark, without the light pollution that has robbed us of the stars today. People live in tune with the rhythm of sunlight in a way that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. When the sun sets, life comes to a standstill, not out of fear, or not just out of fear, but because that is the natural order of things. In the Benedictine monasteries of that era, however, there is something different. There is a careful, almost loving obsession with time. The monks have divided the day and night into hours they call canonical, and each of these hours has a name and a prayer that accompanies it. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. 8 sacred moments spread across the 24 hours of the day, like pearls strung on an invisible necklace. And someone must stay awake to call the others. Someone must keep watch over time whilst the others sleep. That someone is the monk assigned to the night watch. The rudimentary device he uses to measure the passing of the hours is called an horologium, a water clock, an hourglass, which lets time drip away drop by drop, as if time itself were a liquid slowly emptying. The monk sits beside that device in the darkness of the chapter house and listens. He listens to the dripping. He listens to the silence of the monastery. He listens to his own breathing. which grows deeper, more measured. In that solitude inhabited only by time, there is something sacred about this vigil, something that goes beyond religious duty and enters the realm of the mystical. The monk is not simply measuring time, he is guarding it. He is the guardian of that threshold between the hours, between sleep and wakefulness, between yesterday and tomorrow. And whilst the other monks rest in their cells, whilst their breathing becomes slow and steady like the swell of a calm sea, he listens to the dripping of the hourglass and thinks, perhaps that time is a prayer said in silence. The drops fall, one after another, with a patience no human being could imitate, but which we can all admire. Each drop is a second, or something akin to a second, and each second is a small eternity that passes and does not return, but which does not need to return either, for it has already been. It has already existed. It has already fulfilled its role as the bridge between the previous moment and the next. The monk closes his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The gentle sway of sleep brushes against him without quite catching him. And in that instant, on that delightful border between consciousness and rest, the seconds stop ticking. Not because time has stopped, but because the man who measured it has found, albeit briefly, the peace of not needing to measure it. The centuries pass, as the centuries always pass, with that apparent slowness that is only perceived when viewed from the outside, from the safe distance of the present. And time continues to be measured, guarded, interpreted by human hands that seek in its rhythm some kind of order, some kind of meaning. We now come to 14th century Europe. Medieval cities are growing, expanding beyond their original walls, filling with guilds and merchants and craftsmen who need to coordinate their activities with a precision that the sun and the monastery bells can no longer sufficiently provide. And then they appear in the towers of churches and town halls in the most important cities, the first mechanical clocks of which we have historical records appear. The first documented mechanical clock of which we are certain was installed in Milan in the year 1335. A date that historians have refined over time, but which gives us a starting point for understanding how everything changed. That clock had no face or hands. It had only a bell that rang every hour. One chime for the first hour, two for the second, and so on until the full 24 hours. The whole city could hear it, and the whole city, for the first time, shared a common sense of time. Imagine what that meant. Imagine having lived your whole life in a world where time was a personal matter, something each person interpreted according to the position of the sun or the bells you happened to hear, and suddenly finding yourself in a world where a metallic voice tells the whole city at the same time exactly what time of day or night it is. It is a revolution, a silent revolution made of metal and gears and the infinite patience of the craftsman who learnt to make something that had never existed before. Those early clockmakers, those masters of time, worked in small, dark workshops, lit by the flickering light of candles, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal. Their fingers, calloused from years of working with fine tools, knew the texture of every cogwheel, of every lever, of every spring. They built things that no human being had built before, and they did so with absolute concentration, with that kind of total presence in the moment that Easterners describe with words for which we have no exact translation. They were simply in what they were doing, without thinking of the past or the future, only of that cog that had to fit perfectly with the next so that time could run its course. And whilst they built clocks, whilst they created machines to measure time, they were also, paradoxically, inhabiting the present in a completely full way. They were within time, not running after it. Night falls over the medieval city. The torches that lit the streets are going out one by one. The merchants close their stalls. The apprentices gather up their tools. The children are called home from the alleyways where they were playing. And the city, which during the day was a bustling and complex organism, begins to breathe more slowly. The streets empty. The windows of the houses darken from bottom to top, like eyelids slowly closing. And from the church tower, the clock keeps its rhythm, a rhythm that neither speeds up nor stops because it cannot, because that is precisely its nature, to be constant when everything else changes. That constancy is a gift that the inhabitants of the medieval city perhaps did not fully appreciate because it was too new, too present to be seen in perspective. But we, from here, from this moment in which we live, surrounded by screens and notifications and artificial urgencies, can recognize with a clarity that hurts a little the constancy of mechanical time, that unchanging tick that neither judges nor presses, was a perfect companion in sleep. It was there, always there, asking for nothing, demanding nothing, simply marking the passing of the seconds with the same patience with which the universe has been marking its own time since before anyone existed to hear it. Let's move on a little further. We cross the threshold of the 17th century and find ourselves in the Netherlands, in that Holland of painters and merchants and scientists that was, for an astonishing period, the intellectual center of the Western world. In the year 1656, a man named Christian Huygens invented something that would forever change the way human beings measure time. He invented the pendulum clock. The pendulum is one of those ideas that, once you know them, it seems impossible that anyone ever needed to discover them. It is so elegant, so simple, so inevitably true. A mass suspended from a fixed point that swings back and forth with a period that depends on the length of the string, not on the speed of the initial impulse or the weight of the mass. Always the same time, always the same rhythm, time and again, with a precision that previous clocks had been unable to achieve. Huygens built his first pendulum clock and discovered that clocks of the time could be off by several minutes a day. His invention reduced that error to seconds. And that reduction in error was not merely a technical achievement. It was something much deeper. It was a moment when humanity managed, for the first time, to synchronize with real time in a genuine way, not by interpreting it, not by approximating it, but by keeping pace with it with unprecedented fidelity. The sound that made the pendulum clock famous is the one we all know, even if we don't know where it comes from. The tick-tock. Those two asymmetrical syllables that mimic the movement of the pendulum, one sound as it swings to one side, another as it swings back. Tick-tock. Tick-tock. There is something hypnotic about that binary rhythm that sound scientists and sleep psychologists have studied for decades without ever fully exhausting it. There is something about that regular alternation that tells the human nervous system that all is well, that the world is running its course, that there is nothing to fear in this darkness, because time continues to pass at its usual pace, and that means reality remains intact. It is possible that this sound, that soft, constant ticking of the pendulum clock, is one of the most comforting sounds that humankind has ever created. Not because it is musically beautiful, although it has its own music, but because it is honest. It is a sound that tells the truth, that says, "Here I am, here I still am." Time has not stopped, but neither is it running wild. Time goes at its own pace, which is also your pace when you manage to surrender to it. In 17th century Dutch homes, those pendulum clocks occupied prominent places. They were in the main rooms, sometimes in the bedrooms, and their sound permeated the nighttime silence of the houses with that constant, gentle presence. Children who grew up in those houses with a pendulum clock on the wall developed a relationship with time that was fundamentally peaceful. Time was something that passed whilst they lived, not something that pursued or threatened them. It was a companion, not an adversary. And there, in that small distinction, in that subtle difference between time as a companion and time as an adversary, lies the whole difference in the world. Because the way we relate to time determines, to a large extent, the way we relate to everything else. With work, with rest, with the people we love, with ourselves. Let us continue our journey. The 18th century arrives with its enlightenment and its ideas and its conviction that human reason can order the world in the same way that the cogs of a clock order time. In England, in that era of inventors and explorers and men who believed with almost religious fervor in progress, there is a question that haunts sailors and scientists and the Royal Navy: how to determine longitude on the high seas. For a ship in the middle of the ocean, knowing exactly where it is a matter of life and death. Latitude can be determined by observing the stars, but longitude requires knowing precisely the time difference between your position and a reference meridian. And to know that time difference, you need a clock that works with absolute precision, even in the brutal conditions of a moving ship, with the changes in temperature and humidity and the constant vibration of the sea. A man named John Harrison devoted decades of his life to solving that problem. He began working on it in the early years of the 18th century and did not finally resolve it until 1763, by which time he was over 70 years old and had built 4 versions of his marine chronometer, each more accurate than the last. He was not a man of science in the academic sense of the word. He was originally a carpenter, a craftsman from Lincolnshire who had learned the principles of mechanical movement out of curiosity and a love of precision. Harrison's 4th chronometer, the one that finally passed all the tests set by the Board of Longitude, was a masterpiece of miniaturization and ingenuity. It was the size of a large pocket watch and operated with a precision that astonished all who tested it. His greater than on a trial voyage to Jamaica, lasting 81 days at sea. It deviated by less than 2 minutes from the actual time. Less than 2 minutes over 81 days. That is to say, less than 1.5 seconds per day. That precision changed the world in ways we have not yet fully understood. It allowed ships to sail with a safety previously impossible. It allowed the world to be mapped with unprecedented accuracy. It allowed, ultimately, humanity to master space in a new way, using time as a tool. But what interests us about Harrison tonight is not his historical significance, although it is enormous, but something more intimate. Something to do with that love of precision that kept him working for decades, with that infinite patience with which he built and rebuilt his instruments, with that way of relating to time that was at once scientific and almost contemplative. Harrison spent hours, days, weeks, observing the movement of his clocks, listening to their rhythm, searching for the most imperceptible deviations. And in that process of deep listening, of absolute attention to the smallest details of mechanical time, there is something we recognize as our own. Something that all human beings do when night falls and the noise of the world fades away and we are left alone with our own consciousness and the soft sound of the seconds passing. The night is time's laboratory. It is when we hear most clearly, is greater than it is when the ticking of a clock, or the dripping of a tap, or the rhythm of our own breathing becomes the protagonist of the silence. And in that nocturnal listening, there is something that connects us with all those who have listened before us. With the monk of the medieval water clock is greater than with the Dutch craftsman who built the first pendulum clock. With Harrison and his chronometer, with all those who have found in the rhythm of time a reason to be at peace. Let us now travel to a different continent, to a different civilization, to remind ourselves that this relationship between human beings and measured time is neither exclusively European nor exclusively Western. We are in Japan, in the Edo period, which spans roughly from the year 1600 to 1868. It is an era of relative peace and extraordinary cultural refinement, an era in which art, philosophy, and craftsmanship in Japan reached levels that still amaze us today. In Edo period Japan, time was measured in a radically different way to the European method. The day was not divided into 24 equal hours, but into 12 periods that varied in length according to the season. In summer, the daytime hours were longer than the nighttime ones. In winter, the reverse was true. Time was, in a sense, organic. It adapted to nature rather than imposing itself upon it. When mechanical clocks arrived in Japan, brought by the first contacts with Europe in the late 16th century, Japanese craftsmen adapted them to their own system of measuring time. They built what are known as wadokai, Japanese-style clocks, which could be manually adjusted so that the length of the hours changed as the seasons changed. It was a mechanically extraordinary solution, requiring far greater technical sophistication than European clocks of the same period. But what makes the Wadokai truly unique is not its technical complexity, but its underlying philosophy. These clocks did not seek to impose a uniform, artificial time on the natural world. They sought to listen to the natural world and reproduce its rhythm. The time they measured was the time of nature, the time of the seasons, the time that living beings have had inscribed in their bodies since the beginning of life on this planet. There is something in that philosophy that speaks directly to us about what it means to truly rest. Resting is not simply stopping doing things. It is synchronizing with the deepest rhythm of life, that rhythm which exists beneath all the urgencies and all the obligations and all the noise of the world. It is returning to that organic time, to that time which flows to the rhythm of the breath and the heart, and the darkness that gently falls upon the world each night. The Japanese of the Edo period were conscious of this rhythm, which manifested itself in many other cultural practices, from the tea ceremony to the art of ikebana, from haiku poetry to the practice of Zen. All these forms of culture shared the same fundamental attitude, that of being present in the moment without trying to hasten or hold it back. That of letting time be what it is, a flowing river, without trying to swim against the current or cling to the banks. And in that attitude, in that cultural wisdom distilled over centuries of practice and reflection, lay a secret of sleep that the people of Edo period Japan knew well. When the time comes to rest, the body knows it. The signs are there, in the drop in temperature, in the changing light, in the heaviness that begins to settle on the eyelids. And if one learns to listen to those signals rather than ignore them, if one learns to surrender to the rhythm of time rather than fight against it, sleep comes of its own accord, effortlessly, like water finding its level. Let us continue. The 19th century brought with it the Industrial Revolution and, with it, a profound transformation of the relationship between human beings and time. For the first time in history, there are factories operating at night, work shifts extending beyond what natural light would allow, and a demand for temporal precision that goes far beyond what church bells or town hall clocks can satisfy. This is the age of pocket watches, small masterpieces of horology that men carry with them everywhere, that they consult constantly, that become a symbol of status and reliability. The 19th century man who owns a fine pocket watch is a man who controls his time, who does not waste it, who manages it with the efficiency of a machine. but it is also the era of something more intimate and beautiful. It is the era when watches definitively enter the bedroom. The bedside clock, that nocturnal companion occupying the place of honor beside the bed, becomes a familiar and cherished object in the homes of the European and North American middle classes. It is small, usually made of bronze or silver, with a white enamel dial and black Roman numerals, and its mechanism produces that soft ticking sound that becomes the most familiar sound of the night. There is something deeply intimate about that bedside clock. Unlike the tower clock that speaks to the whole city, or the pocket watch that accompanies a man in his public life, the bedside clock is personal. It is yours. It shares your most private space, the space of sleep and dreams. It listens to your breathing. It bears witness to your sleepless nights and your nights of deep rest. It is there when you close your eyes, and it is there when you open them. In 19th century novels, that bedside clock frequently appears as a secondary character laden with meaning. In hospital wards, where time carries special weight. In the bedrooms of children learning to tell the time. In the bedrooms of the elderly who listen to the ticking on sleepless nights and count the seconds as if each were a little treasure not to be wasted. Charles Dickens, that master of nocturnal atmosphere, describes in several of his novels the sound of clocks at night with a precision that reveals how much time he himself spent listening to them. In his pages, the ticking of a clock can be threatening or reassuring, urgent or leisurely, is greater than depending on the mood of the character listening to it. The fact is, the sound of time is not neutral. We interpret it through what we carry within us. And when what we carry within us is peace, the ticking becomes a lullaby. That image of the clock as a lullaby is one that deserves us to pause for a moment to contemplate it. Lullabies are, in all cultures of the world, regular, repetitive rhythms that mimic the movement babies associate with safety and comfort. The rocking of a mother's arms, the movement of the cradle, the steady pace of someone walking, and the ticking of a clock shares exactly that structure. It is regular. It is repetitive. It does not change. It is not surprising. And in that absence of surprise, there is a very clear message for the nervous system. There is no danger. You can let your guard down. You can rest. Sleep studies conducted throughout the 20th century have confirmed what previous generations knew intuitively. Regular, constant background noises, what scientists call white noise or pink noise promote sleep because they mask the irregular sounds that might wake the sleeper, and because they give the brain something to anchor itself to. A fixed point in the ocean of nocturnal silence. A reference that says, time goes on. Everything is fine. And the ticking of a clock is, in many ways, the oldest and most meaningful version of that background noise. It is not just a regular sound. It is a sound that speaks of time, of continuity, of the implicit promise that tomorrow will come. And that promise, that quiet assurance of the future, is one of the most important gifts that rest needs in order to take hold. We now come to a period that is closer to us in time, but which, in certain respects, seems to belong to another world. We are in the early decades of the 20th century, in a Europe that does not yet know what lies ahead, living with a mixture of optimism and anxiety that historians have often described, but which is difficult to grasp in all its complexity. It is the era of grand hotels, of ocean liners, of the first aeroplanes. It is the era in which time has become the most valuable currency of the modern world, is greater than trains depart with Swiss punctuality. Business meetings are scheduled with military precision, and the wristwatch, that miniaturized descendant of the pocket watch, has begun to replace it as an everyday object. But it is also the era of 5 o'clock tea, of evening strolls, of long dinners where time stretched out with pleasure rather than being compressed by urgency. It was an era of contradictions, like all eras, where accelerated modernity coexisted with rituals of slowness that served as outlets, as reminders that time also had a qualitative dimension, not just a quantitative one. In middle-class homes of that era, the table clock was a central feature of the living room. It was usually made of marble or fine wood, with a case that protected the mechanism and amplified its sound. Is greater than its ticking provided a constant backdrop to conversations, to reading, to those comfortable silences that are the hallmark of families who have learned to be at ease together. And at night, when the family retired, when the lights went out and the house fell silent, that table clock continued its work with the same faithfulness as ever. Its sound traveled through the dark corridors and reached the bedrooms in a muffled tone, where people who had just fallen asleep incorporated it into their dreams without realizing they were doing so. It was part of the soundscape of the night. It was part of what it meant to be at home. There is something to be said about that concept, about the idea of being at home. Psychologists and philosophers have reflected at length on what it means to be at home in a profound sense. beyond the mere geographical reference to a specific building. Being at home means being in a place where time flows in a familiar way, where the sounds are familiar, where the rhythm of the hours has the texture of something you have experienced before and recognize as your own. And the clock in the living room, with its ticking that you have been listening to since childhood, is one of the most powerful elements of that sense of home. Let's think of people leaving home for the first time. University students on their first night in halls of residence. Young people who have moved to a new city. Travelers in unfamiliar hotels. Everyone knows that peculiar moment of the first night in a new place, that gentle but real disorientation caused by not recognizing the sounds of the surroundings. The building creaks in a different way. The traffic outside has a different rhythm. And if there's a clock, if that clock exists, it has a ticking that doesn't sound like the ticking you've known all your life. It is a small detail, almost irrelevant if viewed from a distance, but in the experience of the dream, small details are enormous. The nervous system, which during the night is on watchful alert at a level that consciousness does not fully perceive, registers every sound in the environment and assesses whether it is familiar or new, whether it is safe or requires attention. And a familiar ticking, a sound known, associated since childhood with the safety of home, is a signal of safety as powerful as the presence of someone you trust. There are elderly people who, when they move into a care home, take their lifelong clock with them. Not because they need to know the time. For that, there are digital clocks on every wall. But because they need that sound. They need that nocturnal companion that has spent decades keeping them company at night. That was there when their children were born and when their parents died and when they themselves weathered the crises and joys of a whole lifetime. That clock knows things about them that no other person knows. It has been a silent witness to everything. And that faithfulness of the clock, that constant presence that does not judge, does not forget, and does not change, is one of the purest forms of companionship that exists. A companionship that demands nothing, that doesn't need you to pay it any attention. That is simply there, marking the time with its gentle rhythm, telling you without words that the world keeps turning and that you, in the midst of that turning, can rest. The seconds of this story keep ticking by. They haven't stopped. They cannot stop. But they have found a way to become almost imperceptible, to become so gentle and so constant that you no longer hear them as something separate from yourself, but as part of your own presence in the world. And in that gentle fusion between the rhythm of the clock and the rhythm of your body, there is something that closely resembles peace. We are now in the second half of the 20th century. The world has changed in profound and sometimes painful ways, but also in astonishing ways, full of possibilities. Technology has entered our homes in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. Is greater than television, radio, the telephone, and watches, which have also evolved, moving from pendulum to quartz, from hands to digital numbers, from complex mechanisms to simple, precise circuits. The quartz watch, invented in the first half of the 20th century, but popularized on a massive scale from the 1970s onwards, changed watchmaking forever. There was no longer a pendulum to swing. There were no longer gears requiring oil and periodic adjustment. Just a quartz crystal vibrating 32,668 times per second, always exactly that, and whose vibrations were converted into an electrical signal to move the hands or the digital numbers. It was unprecedented precision, accessible for the first time to anyone at a minimal cost. But there was something lost in that gain in precision. Silence. Quartz watches, unlike mechanical watches, do not produce the continuous ticking that results from the oscillation of the anchor over the escape wheel. They produce a different sound, a more discreet one, the sharp, precise click that occurs once per second when the stepper motor moves the second hand to the next digit. A sound that many describe as less warm, less lively than the mechanical ticking, more efficient, but less poetic. And with the digital clock, that sound disappears completely. There is nothing to hear. Time passes without leaving a sound. And this absence, which might seem irrelevant from a purely functional point of view, has consequences that are by no means irrelevant to the experience of sleep and rest. Because it turns out that the sound of time, that ticking, which 19th century critics of modernity feared would drive citizens mad, was in fact a gift. It was the sound of time passing in an audible, verifiable, tangible way. It was proof that seconds existed as concrete entities, as tiny objects falling one after another into the silence of the night. And when that sound disappears, something also changes in the way we experience the nighttime. Without the ticking, without that sonic anchor, the time of night can become strange. It can stretch in ways that are unsettling. It can lose its texture. People who suffer from insomnia often describe this experience of nocturnal time without reference as disorienting. The silence is not soothing but empty. The absence of sound is not peace but anxious anticipation. And that is why, for that reason, which scientists have begun to understand better, but which human intuition has known for centuries, many people have, in recent decades, returned to seek out that sound. They have returned to mechanical clocks, to pendulum clocks, to wind-up clocks that must be wound every week with that ritual gesture, which is in itself a way of tending to time. They have returned to seek out the ticking not as a sign of modernity or precision, but as company, as comfort, as the sound of something that is alive and that remains there even if you close your eyes. There are watch shops in the world's major cities where you can still find mechanical watches made using the same principles employed by the master watches of the 17th century. Their mechanisms are visible through glass faces that reveal the dance of the gears, the oscillation of the anchor, the constant turning of the cogwheels. They are objects that speak of patience and craftsmanship and of a relationship with time that is qualitative as well as quantitative. And in the world's antique markets, there are clocks that have survived decades and sometimes centuries. Wall clocks with their lead weights hanging from chains. Table clocks with their polished wooden cases. Pocket watches that belong to someone who is no longer here. Each of those clocks has marked thousands of hours of sleep that are no longer remembered, thousands of nights that passed and are gone, thousands of awakenings that began with the slow realization of that familiar ticking that said, "You're still here." Time went on. Everything is fine. When one of those old watches starts up again after having stood still for years, after an expert watchmaker has cleaned and lubricated it and adjusted it with the patience and love of someone who brings life back to something that had lost it, there is a moment of tense silence that precedes the first tick. And when that first tick comes, when the mechanism awakens and begins its age-old work anew, there is something that can only be described as joy. A small, precise joy, the size of a second. That small, precise joy is what this story has been seeking from the very beginning. Not the grandeur of great inventions, nor the significance of great discoveries, but that precise moment when time begins to flow again after having stopped, or when it seems to stop so that we may rest. That instant on the threshold between wakefulness and sleep where the ticking of the clock becomes so soft, so familiar, so much a part of yourself that you no longer know whether you are hearing it or dreaming it. And that's fine. That's exactly what has to happen. The great philosophers of time have written pages and pages trying to capture the nature of that moment. Aristotle thought that time was the measure of motion according to before and after. Newton conceived of it as an absolute container, independent of anything that occurred within it. Leibniz saw it as a relationship between events, with no existence of its own outside of them. And Einstein demonstrated that time was relative, that it passed differently depending on the observer's speed and the gravity of the field in which they found themselves. But none of those great philosophers and scientists of the time, who studied it with all the rigor of their intellect, managed to capture what happens at the exact moment someone falls asleep. That mysterious transition, that invisible boundary we cross every night without knowing exactly when we have crossed it. The moment when the eyelids become too heavy to keep open, when thoughts lose their coherence and become fragmented, elusive, full of images that do not correspond to any logic but which have their own beauty. When the ticking of the clock, which, a moment ag, was a distinct and precise sound, becomes something more diffuse, more distant, as if the clock were moving away, or as if it were you moving away from it. At that moment, the seconds stop ticking, not because the clock has stopped, not because time has suspended its laws, but because you, who are the only measure of time that truly matters, have found the space where time has no power, the space of dreams, where there is no before or after, where the present stretches without limits, where the body repairs itself and the mind processes and the soul, if that concept makes sense, rests from being. It is a space that every human being knows, and yet which is impossible to describe from within, because from within there is no observer to describe it. There is only the great silence of deep rest. There is only that still ocean that lies beneath all the storms of conscious life. There is only time that no longer needs to be measured because it has found its own perfection in the absence of measure. Medieval monks called it by different names. Zen masters also called it by different names. Poets of all ages have sought the words for that state without ever quite finding them, because that state exists precisely at the limits of language, on the edge where words dissolve and what remains is pure experience. And yet, although we cannot describe it, we recognize it when we reach it. We recognize it in the body that relaxes completely, in the muscles that release a tension they did not know they were holding. We recognize it in the breath that grows deeper and slower, that descends from the chest to the belly, that takes on that unhurried rhythm which physiologists associate with deep sleep. We recognize it in the warmth that spreads through the limbs as if someone had lit a gentle fire at the center of the body. And on that path towards rest, on that journey we take every night from wakefulness to sleep, the sound of measured time is a guide. It does not tell us where we are going. It does not rush us. It merely accompanies us with its ever-constant rhythm, with its infinite patience, with that unpretentious loyalty which is the noblest trait of the finest companions. This story began in a medieval monastery, with the dripping of an hourglass in the darkness of the early morning. It has traveled through the centuries, passing through the first mechanical clocks of European cities, through Huygens' pendulum, through Harrison's chronometer, through the Japanese wadokai of the Edo period, through the 19th century table clocks, through the quartz watches that democratize timekeeping, until reaching the present moment. Throughout this journey, what remains constant is neither the technology, nor the precision, nor the design. What remains constant is the relationship between the human being and the time it measures. That silent conversation that takes place between the person in need of rest and the mechanism that reminds them, with its gentle, unchanging rhythm, that time marches on, and that this march is a good thing, because that is the promise the clock makes every night. It does not tell you that everything will be all right tomorrow. It cannot promise you that. It does not know what awaits you tomorrow, just as you do not know. But it tells you something more fundamental and more reassuring than any specific promise. It tells you that time goes on, that the seconds keep ticking by, one after another, with their usual patience, that the universe hasn't changed its plans overnight, that the world is still the same world it was when you closed your eyes, and that continuity, that faithfulness of time to itself, is the deepest foundation of rest. We do not sleep well because the future is certain. We sleep well because the present is constant. Because there is something, even if it is only the ticking of a clock in the dark, that tells us time is trustworthy, that we can surrender our consciousness to it for a few hours, knowing that when we claim it back, time will still be there, waiting for us with the same patience with which it has always waited. The pendulum swings back and forth, with its movement, which is one of the most perfect images of life, going and coming back, moving forward and returning, being in the world and withdrawing from it, waking and sleeping. There is no contradiction in that movement. There is rhythm. There is music. There is the simple and profound wisdom that everything that goes also returns, and that in that coming and going lies the essence of all that exists. The monk of the medieval water clock at some point during his night watch, eventually succumbed to sleep. He did so slowly, without realizing exactly when he crossed the threshold. One moment he was listening to the dripping of the water, and the next he was in the place where there is no time, where there is no measure, where there is nothing except deep, nameless rest. And the dripping of the hourglass continued, drop by drop, with the same patience as always, measuring time whilst the one who guarded it rested, fulfilling its function as faithfully as possible, without anyone seeing it, without anyone hearing it, simply being what it was, a measure of time in a world that slept. Outside, the night ran its course. The stars traced their slow arcs across the dark sky. In the fields surrounding the monastery, the animals slept in their stables, and the crickets sang with that constancy that is the nocturnal version of the ticking of a clock. The moon moved along its invisible path, and somewhere between the stars and the earth, time remained what it had always been, the silent river that carries everything forward with a patience that has no beginning and no end. The clock that marks the hour of rest is not an instrument of pressure but of permission. It does not tell you that you must do something. It tells you that you have already done enough, that now is the time to let go, that the time which has been yours during the day to fill as you wished now takes care of itself so that you may disappear into sleep without fear of missing anything important. Because whilst you sleep, time does not wait for you. It does not stop for you, but neither does it abandon you. It continues on its way with the same faithfulness as ever, and when you wake up, it will be there. A few hours will have passed without you. It will have filled those hours with its usual rhythm of seconds and minutes. And when you meet it again, you will recognize it. Just as you recognize someone who has been waiting without growing impatient. The seconds that stopped ticking are not, in reality, the seconds that came to a halt. They are the seconds that no longer need to be counted. The seconds that have done their job of bringing you here, to this moment just before you fall asleep, and which can now rest too. Every second that has passed today has built the bridge to this moment. And in this moment, the bridge has reached its destination. There is an ancient story, so ancient that no one remembers exactly where it began, which says that every night when we fall asleep, we die a little. Not in the dark sense that those words might have, but in the luminous sense we let go of ourselves for a few hours. We cease to be the self that thinks and plans and remembers and fears. And in that letting go, in that brief, temporary dissolution of what we believe ourselves to be, there is a rest that goes far deeper than mere muscular repose. It is the rest of being, the rest of consciousness that allows itself not to be consciousness for a while, the rest of time that allows itself not to be measured. And when that happens, when we cross that invisible threshold that separates wakefulness from sleep, the clock carries on with its work alone. It continues to count the seconds with the same faithfulness as ever, without anyone listening to it, without anyone needing to hear it. Simply being what it is, the guardian of time during the hours when time does not belong to us. The night is long. The hours stretch out, calm and dark, like a field without a horizon. And in some corner of the bedroom, or in the hallway, or in the living room, the clock continues its song. A sound so familiar you no longer hear it. So constant it has become part of your own inner silence. So soft it closely resembles the sound of your own breathing, or the beating of your own heart, or the ancient, wise rhythm that has existed within you since before you were born. Let that sound carry you. Don't resist. There's nowhere you need to go tonight except within. And the path inward requires neither effort nor direction. It simply requires letting go, letting the body weigh as it weighs. Let thoughts pass without holding on to them, like clouds in a sky that is in no hurry to clear. Let time do its work on its own, whilst you rest from doing everything. The ticking of the clock grows fainter, not because it moves, not because it changes, but because you are moving. You are gently drifting away from the surface of the world, towards the still depths where time has no power and sleep waits with open arms. The seconds keep ticking by. 1, then another, then yet another, with the patience that only time possesses, with the faithfulness that only things possess which can do nothing but be true to their own nature. And at some point tonight, as on every night, you will cross that threshold. Without knowing exactly when, without being able to pinpoint the precise moment. And on the other side of that threshold, waiting with all the stillness in the world, will be the rest you deserve. The seconds that have stopped ticking are waiting for you there. In that place, without a name or time, in that place where the clock needs not mark anything because everything is already complete. Go.
Release the tension in your forehead. Relax the muscles around your eyes. Let your arms rest completely, heavy and warm at either side of your body. Your breath now flows naturally, like gentle waves lapping at the shore and receding effortlessly. The stories you have heard tonight slowly fade away, becoming distant whispers that you no longer need to follow. If this journey through time has served you well, you can support this space by liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. That way, more people seeking rest may find refuge here. And if you are still awake, there is another story waiting in silence, ready to guide you deeper into sleep. But for now, let the voices of the past fade gently away. Let the names, dates, and events melt into the mist of the night's oblivion. The story can wait until tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let go of everything. Rest deeply, and may you have sweet dreams.